The hall was filled with laughter, polished shoes tapping against marble floors, and the clinking of glasses echoing through the grand ballroom. It was a charity gala, the kind of evening where wealth was paraded as casually as fine jewelry, and where generosity was often more about appearances than compassion. Among the dazzling gowns and sharp tuxedos stood a man everyone seemed to gravitate toward, a self-made millionaire named Richard Hale. His smile was practiced, his charm deliberate, and his words often laced with sarcasm that drew both admiration and nervous laughter from those around him. But in the corner of that glittering room sat someone no one noticed. A little girl, no more than 10, wearing a faded dress that didn't belong in such a glamorous setting. Her hair was tied back with a worn ribbon, her shoes scuffed and small, and in her lap rested an old violin case, its edges scratched, its handle patched with tape. Her name was Lily. She had been invited by one of the organizers who thought a child's performance might soften the mood of an evening otherwise consumed by vanity. When Richard's eyes caught her sitting there, he smirked. "What's this?" he asked, his voice carrying across the room as people turned to watch. "A little entertainer? Tell me, sweetheart, are you going to play us a masterpiece on that toy of yours?" The crowd chuckled, some hiding their laughter behind champagne flutes, others outright sneering at the tiny figure gripping her violin like it was her lifeline. Lily swallowed hard. Her hands trembled, but she stood up, her small frame barely reaching Richard's chest as she faced him. Before she could say a word, Richard leaned down, mockingly whispering loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Play, and if you impress me, I'll adopt you. How's that for a deal?" The laughter that followed was cruel, a storm of ridicule disguised as entertainment. But Lily didn't cry. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she carefully lifted the violin from its case, placed it under her chin, and closed her eyes. The first note silenced the room. It was pure, trembling, yet breathtakingly alive. Her bow moved with a grace no one expected, each stroke weaving a melody that seemed to pull at something hidden deep within every heart present. The playful arrogance that filled the hall moments earlier was gone, replaced by something heavier, something raw. The tune she played wasn't polished like a symphony written for concert halls. It was rough in places, but it carried a truth that could not be ignored. Each note told a story of loss, of nights spent hungry, of a little girl who had learned to use music as her only comfort when the world felt too cruel. Richard froze, his smirk fading into something he hadn't felt in years: shame. He had laughed at her. He had mocked her as though she were nothing more than a spectacle for his amusement. But now, with every trembling note, she stripped him of his arrogance, leaving him exposed before the very people who once applauded his wit. Tears began to fall, not from Lily's eyes, but from those who listened. Women dabbed at their cheeks, men shifted uncomfortably, and even the most hardened skeptics could feel the undeniable force of her music. Lily's bow quivered as she reached the climax of her piece, her small body pouring out everything she had carried within her young heart. When the final note hung in the air, the silence that followed was deafening. No one dared move. Then, slowly, as though in reverence, the room erupted into applause, louder, more passionate than any performance that night. Richard was the first to stand, though not to mock. His face was pale, his eyes glassy, and his lips parted as though searching for words that wouldn't come. For the first time in years, he wasn't the center of attention because of his wealth, his wit, or his influence. It was because a little girl had reminded him of something he had long forgotten. That greatness doesn't come from power or money, but from the courage to be vulnerable and real. He walked toward her slowly, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch the violin case she clutched protectively. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked softly, almost afraid of the answer. "My mother taught me," Lily whispered before she went to heaven. The room held its breath. Richard's throat tightened. He remembered his own mother, the woman who once scraped coins together to buy him his first piano lesson before illness took her away. He had buried that memory beneath years of success, building walls of wealth to forget the ache of his past. But this little girl, standing so bravely before him, had brought it all back with just a song. Without thinking, he knelt down, meeting her eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for the way I spoke to you." The crowd that once laughed now watched in silence, many of them ashamed of their own part in mocking her. Richard's hand shook as he placed it gently on her shoulder. "You don't need my name or my money to prove your worth, Lily. You've already shown more strength tonight than I ever have." For the first time that evening, Lily allowed herself a small, shy smile. She didn't need applause or promises. Her music had spoken for her. But Richard couldn't let her walk away, not after what she had awakened in him. "Lily," he said firmly, his voice carrying not arrogance but sincerity, "I don't want to adopt you because of a deal or because of your music. I want to because I see you. I see the little girl who deserves love, care, and a future brighter than this." The hall was still. No laughter, no whispers, just the weight of a moment no one would forget. Lily clutched her violin tighter. She had come expecting to be invisible, a shadow in a room full of glittering lights. Instead, she had become the light that revealed the emptiness of wealth without kindness. And Richard Hale, the man once defined by his fortune, found himself transformed by a little girl with a scratched violin and a heart too big for the world to ignore. Richard's words hung in the air like a fragile promise, trembling yet full of truth. Lily's wide eyes searched his face, unsure if this was another cruel jest or the beginning of something real. For a moment, her small hand tightened around the violin, as though it were the only anchor she could trust. But then she saw it, something genuine in his gaze, something that had nothing to do with wealth or pride. It was the look of a man who had finally remembered what it meant to care. The silence was broken by a gentle ripple of applause, not for a performance this time, but for courage, hers and his. A woman in the front row whispered, "Take her home," and soon others joined in, nodding, murmuring words of encouragement. The room that once laughed now lifted Lily up with a quiet reverence she had never known. Richard reached into his pocket, not for a wallet, not for a pen, but for a handkerchief. With trembling hands, he offered it to her. "No child should cry alone again," he said softly. Lily's lips quivered as she took it. She didn't cry, but her eyes shone with something new hope. The gala ended differently than anyone expected. Instead of the usual auction and speeches, the night closed with a promise. Richard walked out of that ballroom not as the arrogant millionaire who mocked a child, but as a man who held her hand as though it were the most valuable thing he had ever touched. Days turned into weeks, and the world that had once mocked Lily now celebrated her. News spread of the little girl whose music humbled a millionaire. Offers for scholarships, music lessons, and even concert opportunities poured in. But Richard was careful. He shielded her from the noise, making sure she had what she had longed for most, a home. For the first time, Lily had her own room with soft blankets, a desk to write music on, and shelves filled with books and toys. Richard bought her a new violin, polished and perfect, but when he handed it to her, she only smiled and said, "I'll still keep this one. It's the one Mama gave me." And he understood. Their days were not without challenges. Richard had to learn patience, to trade boardrooms and deadlines for bedtime stories and violin recitals in the living room. Lily had to learn to trust that he would not leave, that promises could be kept. But with each passing day, they grew into something neither of them had expected, a family. One evening, months later, Richard sat in the small audience of a community concert. Lily walked onto the stage in a simple dress, her violin in hand. She didn't play for fame or for applause, but for the man sitting in the front row, the man who once mocked her but now cheered louder than anyone. As the final note soared through the hall, Richard rose to his feet, tears streaming down his face. He wasn't clapping for music alone. He was clapping for the miracle that had entered his life in the form of a little girl with a broken violin and an unbreakable spirit. And when Lily looked out into the crowd, her eyes locking on his, she knew she was no longer the girl in the corner, overlooked and forgotten. She was loved, she was seen, and she was finally home.